Thanks for joining me, everyone. For those who do not know me yet, my name is Ron Levine from Mindfulness and Blue Jeans, and I fell ass backwards into mindfulness and insight meditation 24 years ago, during a time when I was dealing with clinical anxiety and depression and a raging panic disorder, which had blown up into agoraphobia. So I was unable to leave the house. I was on short-term disability. Couldn't go past my front door without having a meltdown. And happened to get paired up with a psychologist who, even back in 1998, was already several decades deep into practicing and teaching mindfulness and insight meditation. And he offered me these tools and techniques as a way of dealing with what I was going through. I was not thrilled with his suggestion. My feeling was, I'm on disability. I can't work. I can't do anything. My life is stopped. And here's this guy saying, oh, let's sit and watch the breathing for a while and see what happens. Great. Thanks for that. He didn't give me anything else. And I figured, all right, I'm going to give this an honest shot just long enough that I can go back to him and say, look, dude, this didn't work. Can I have the real treatment now? And as I say, this was 1998. I have still not had that conversation with him. At this point, I probably won't. I'm still practicing every day. Now I'm teaching. And this practice has had a profound impact on my life. And now I offer it to others. And that really brings me to today's talk, which is expanding your comfort zone. The issue that I ran into with agoraphobia didn't happen overnight. I was dealing with panic disorder and anxiety for 8 years. And when I say dealing with, I mean dealing with poorly. Denying it, distracting myself from it, all while earning an honors degree in social psychology, mind you. All right? Dr. Heal Thyself. The agoraphobia really developed out of this intense need to experience comfort or to not experience discomfort. The discomfort specifically of panic attacks. I had a fear of panic attacks, which is a hell of a cycle to fall into. And I kept trying to not feel discomfort. And the more I avoided discomfort, the smaller my comfort zone became until it was, well, my apartment. I read something funny a few weeks ago. It was one of those spiritual things. It says, it's okay to leave your comfort zone. If you don't like what you find, you can always go back. And in my experience, with what I've learned from those days that I was trapped at home and how I got myself out of it, that's not quite true, at least not for me. I've never found a way to go back to the comfort zone. I have found that the comfort zone comes to meet me. The comfort zone has to change when you leave it. You don't go back to it the way it was. A huge turning point in my early practice was this day in, I think it was June of 1998. So I'd been practicing for maybe a month or so. Still trapped at home, but starting to make my way out. And just so happens that I needed some work done on my truck, and the auto mechanic was about 8 or 10 blocks away. At this point, I was able to just get through driving my truck those 8 or 10 blocks up to the mechanic and having my friend drive me right back to the apartment. Scared the hell out of me, but I could pull that off. But then the next day, the truck was ready to be picked up. And at this point, I had started practicing just walking around the block, walking around a couple of blocks, just starting to get past the front door again. And now here was this opportunity to go like 8 or 10 blocks. Holy shit. Can I do this? being 6 or 8 minutes away from the apartment walking, that's well out of the safety zone at that point. I got through it. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes when we get to the how do we do this part, what I consider the practicum of today's talk. But I got through it. And then a funny thing happened. I picked up my truck, interacted with the mechanic, which in itself was horrifying at that point. Right? Drove back the 8 or 10 blocks to the apartment, walked in the apartment, sat down on the couch and was like, whew. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of actual comfort. And that was when the light bulb went off, where I was like, oh, okay. I spent all this time trying to achieve this feeling of comfort by not experiencing discomfort. And what have I just discovered? I've just discovered that comfort is that thing you feel after you've experienced discomfort. Right? It's relative. You can't always continue to feel anything to a greater and greater and greater and greater degree. At some point, it has to start going down, right? And what feels comfortable in one situation may not feel comfortable in another situation. So right there, I started to realize, okay, my comfort zone is not a static thing. It's always either expanding or shrinking. Clearly, letting it shrink didn't work very well for me. So let's try the other thing. There's a story that I mention sometimes in some of my talks about, and this goes back before I started my this actually goes back to around the middle of those 8 years when I was denying and distracting myself from my anxiety and panic back when I was in college. And I had a sociology teacher who gave us the assignment of going to an AA meeting and reporting on it. And many of us in the room had never been to an AA meeting before and felt like, we're going to be intruding. And she explained, no, you're going to an open meeting. People are allowed to do this. And she said, I understand some of you may feel uncomfortable with this assignment. And I was like, oh, good. Okay, she's going to give us an out. There's going to be an alter because this doesn't feel right. She says, I understand some of you may feel uncomfortable with this assignment. You have every right to. You are welcome to feel uncomfortable about it. That was it. I'm 22 years old. And I think it's the first time in my life somebody had actually kind of come out and said, discomfort is allowed. Wait, this is okay? This is acceptable? That's not the message I remember receiving. That was a big aha moment, which, of course, came back to me several years later when I started this practice. One of the things I like to say a lot, to myself as well as others, is uncomfortable doesn't necessarily mean unsafe. Our lizard brain, the one that thinks we're still out on the African savanna with a saber-toothed tiger waiting to eat us, doesn't make that distinction. It's here to keep us alive. So if something doesn't feel right, all right, turn it up to 11. Let's get the fight or flight going. Shoot first, ask questions later. Otherwise, there might not be a later. All right. So that's kind of its job. And that's still there. That's still baked into us. But is it accurate for today's world where most of us are not out on the African savanna and a saber-toothed tiger no longer exists? Yeah, I guess not. I'd like to offer a few thoughts about working with discomfort from a psychological standpoint. And then we'll get into some of what I actually did. Okay. One of the things that I found challenging about working with discomfort is there isn't just the discomfort itself. For myself, this may resonate with some of you. And I didn't realize this at first. This took some insight to see. There's also a fear of failure going on there. Of course, this is more with psychological discomfort than necessarily a physical discomfort. We can also work with physical discomfort. What I'm talking about here is a little more of the psychological, because that's what I've spent more time working with. I found that there's this fear of failure, not just necessarily with a certain thing, a certain event coming up that we might be experiencing some discomfort about, but a fear of not being able to be with the discomfort itself. Again, that lizard brain. Am I going to be okay? And not just am I going to be okay, will I survive, will I live, but what if I can't handle this? What does that say about me? About what I think about myself, about what others are going to think about me? So there's this initial discomfort, but then there's this additional discomfort coming from this fear of failure, fear of the discomfort itself. It's this discomfort about discomfort. And in fact, I have a talk that I gave, I don't know when I did it last time, maybe 6 months ago. I call it the biggest bitch of the human condition. To me, I think the biggest bitch of the human condition is that discomfort always accompanies growth. So every time we are doing something that involves some meaningful growth for us, there's that hurdle of discomfort that we have to get over. Ironically enough, getting over that is in itself part of the growth. So I'd like to offer something that most of you may not have ever heard somebody say out loud. You ever hear that thing where they say, failure is not an option? I think it is. I think it has to be. I was reading something just yesterday, I think it was in the New York Times, something about life hacks. And I saw this thing, I was like, oh, I got to write this down for tomorrow. And it says, when you're beginning a writing project, give yourself permission to write badly. You can't fix it until it's down on paper. I've been practicing yoga for 12, 13 years now. Very challenging, heated power yoga classes. And one of the things that teachers will say sometimes that I have found extremely helpful, usually in half moon pose, which is a very difficult pose to hold and balance in. There's this tendency to not commit fully to the pose because it's very hard not to fall over. And in fact, there was one time that this particular teacher was guiding me through half moon pose once, and he had his hand on my back and he said, "You're struggling," which means either you don't trust me or you don't trust yourself. And that's always stuck with me. But the reason I bring this up is actually something else that he said, which was, there's nothing wrong with falling over in a yoga pose. That's actually a good thing. You have found your edge. That's where the growth happens. That's the wall of the comfort zone. It's a literal act of physically expanding the comfort zone so it's not shrinking. So what we think of as failure, that's information. It's like, oh, okay, I found my edge. Okay. And the edge is not any more static than the comfort zone in itself is. Some days our edge is going to be out further than others. Some days it's going to be a little closer than we'd like, depending on any number of circumstances that might be outside of our control. Are we going to consider that a failure? I haven't found it helpful. It's just information. Oh, this is where it is today. So we work with where it is. And this leads me into the next point, which is something that the Buddha talked about a lot, which was observing things using, and those of you who have been with me know I hate trying to get this word out. I usually do okay. Using the phenomenological approach, which refers to observing processes as they come up and play out without creating a storyline, without creating a narrative, without making it about us, just observing, oh, here's this process. We can do that with the breathing, and in fact, we'll be practicing that today. Our breathing is automatic. Can we control it? Yeah, we can. Do we have to? No. Our body knows how to breathe. Takes care of it for us. So we can just observe it as it happens, as a process. It's not about us, right? So if a feeling of failure comes up in response to trying to expand the comfort zone, okay, there's a feeling of failure. Okay. Just like discomfort, that's allowed. That's information. It's allowed to be here. Doesn't mean it's true. Any more than the lizard brain is correct that we're in danger every time we're uncomfortable. It just means it's a process that's here. A very important part of mindfulness, insight meditation. The two pillars of these practices are wisdom and compassion. We will gain wisdom by continuing to experiment with the comfort zone and seeing the processes that come up. Well, we can have compassion for ourselves, for those processes, including the process of selfing, right? When we get that storyline, I'm the failure. Okay? We can have compassion for that. It's like, okay, there's a feeling associated with this that is not pleasant. Not denying that it's there. Saying, okay, it's here. This is part of this experience. This is also information. It's allowed to say its piece. And in fact, we may in time even develop some gratitude for that voice. Because what does that voice want? Same thing we want, because that voice is us. It wants us to be happy. It's trying to pressure us to do better. It's just not doing it in a way that's particularly skillful, particularly helpful, but it's the only way it knows how. It's like, all right, if you don't do better, I'm going to badger you. You're going to feel like this. It's like, okay. I see where you're trying to go with this. But I know it's not as helpful as you might think it is, based on your limited vantage point. But thank you for trying. I always say this is a 3 steps forward, 2 steps back practice. It's the nature of pretty much anything in my experience. It's not a straight line. So let's spend a few minutes about what I did. I'll talk about my case. And You may find that this may apply directly to something you might be going through, or you may have to massage it a little bit to figure out how to best experiment for yourself. But this is what I did. In those early days when I was trapped at home, being the analytical, left-brained, organizational guy that I am, started to write down a plan for what I was going to do, and got this notebook. And in fact, I thought it would be funny for today to actually bust it out. This is my notebook from 1998, a little pocket notebook. It looks like I started, my first entry was June 11th, 1998. And of course, these days you might use a phone or something electronic, but this is old school stuff, right? And at the top of the page, of the first page, I wrote down some of the techniques that I was working with at the time. Some of these will sound familiar to some of you, like the labeling technique that my first teacher had clued me into, and visualizations, some counting of the breathing. And then on each line, on one page, I would write down the date and what I planned to do to get out of the house in the morning, and then again in the afternoon. And on the flip side of that page, I had the same date, day and date, and then what I actually did and what it was like, how difficult it was. Maybe it wasn't difficult. And typically these early entries are just, okay, walk around the block twice. And in the afternoon, maybe drive some fairly short distance. And I would map them out a week in advance. So on Sunday, I would do that week, Sunday through Saturday. I put down the whole thing. All right, I'm going to try this. I'm going to try this. I'm going to try this. At this point, I was doing a regular sitting every morning, and was also practicing my mindfulness and insight meditation off the cushion constantly as well. I remember that summers being really hot. And we were in this third floor apartment with no air conditioning, and I remember being in there. It was just sweltering, and I'm washing the dishes, and it was just extraordinarily uncomfortable physically, to go along with my extraordinary psychological discomfort. And that was part of my practice. There was no difference to me whether I was sitting on the cushion, whether I was washing the dishes, or if I was out doing these short walks and drives. They were all meditative experiences. Being present, watching what was coming up, watching the breathing, watching the storylines. And I would also include other things that I had come to rely upon for comfort, to see if I could work with those. For example, I was very nervous about being too hungry. Because, well, what if I start to get the hunger shakes or something, and that feels like panic? I had started napping in the afternoons because I felt more comfortable if I wasn't fatigued. It's like, all right, so in addition to my walking and my driving, I'm going to try to not have this extra snack. I'm going to try to wean myself off of daytime napping. And every one of these things was scary and challenging at first. And I do them in gradual increments. And again, it would be 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. The really important thing here was the consistency. I had to do it every day. And I sit here now, almost a quarter of a century later, still regularly putting myself in situations that I find uncomfortable. I've never stopped pushing against the walls of the comfort zone because, again, if it's not expanding, it's shrinking. I'm still the same guy who did that first walk around the block in April of 1998. I've just never stopped. One of the things that I find very helpful in terms of motivation is, like I said earlier, comfort is that thing we feel after discomfort. The greater the challenge, the greater the feeling of relief afterwards. And it becomes very motivating to the point where even when I'm starting to engage in a particular challenge, right away, I will feel like, okay, this is really uncomfortable, but imagine, based on my experience, based on what I know, imagine how this is going to feel afterwards. Like, oof, that's going to be amazing. And then I'll have added this to my repertoire and my comfort zone will be that much further. It starts to develop this healthy cycle rather than the vicious cycle, like the one I was describing earlier about the comfort zone shrinking in around me because I kept avoiding discomfort. I talk a lot in this practice, naturally enough, but with Buddhism and all, about karma. Cause and effect. This is what we're doing here, is setting the causes and conditions for certain effects to arise. Will we always get precisely the effect we want? No. In general, will we? It's been my experience over time. Yeah. So by maintaining this consistency, by consistently setting these causes and conditions, we begin to make space for the things that we cannot necessarily control, that are maybe a little outside of our comfort zone, but we can't directly impact. For example, when I was working with this stuff in 1998, one of the things that made me very anxious was excessive heat, humidity. Made it harder to breathe. Could I control that? No, not really. It was the middle of the summer. And like I said, I remember it being a pretty hot summer. So some days were harder than others simply because of the weather. If it was raining, the way that would trigger the depression. Oh, good Lord. You know? But as I continued building a foundation with what I could control, which was just myself, as that foundation strengthened, it made it possible for me to be able to branch out into some of these other things. Oh, okay. I've gotten a little more accustomed to feeling discomfort when it comes to pulling back from the extra snack, from the extra nap, from going a little extra distance. I've gotten some practice now. I can try to feel this discomfort, this heat, this humidity, this rain. When I was going out driving again, I was terrified of landing in traffic. I mean, holy shit, I'm trapped. I'm stuck in traffic. Can't really control that. Didn't have a Waze back then. Couldn't look up and just see, okay, there's traffic. All right, I'm not going to go that way. Had no way of knowing. Just had to go and hope for the best. That consistency gives us the foundation to withstand the unexpected. And life is always going to have the unexpected in it. One last thing that I'll mention, then we'll practice. And this is a little bit unrelated, but I have found it crucial. I mentioned a little while ago about how I've been doing yoga for the last 12, 13 years, and I've found that physical activity is really, really key, at least for me, when dealing with discomfort. You get the endorphin release, and it'll help regulate the breathing and so forth. It can be really challenging to do it, especially if we're feeling uncomfortable or anxious, which often has a way of feeling fatiguing or like we're losing our energy as it is, so we can't possibly expend more. But the funny thing, had a conversation with my wife, geez, I don't know, probably 20 years ago at this point. And I say this not as a way of making fun of her. I say it because it's so deeply resonated with me, and I have a feeling it would resonate with other people as well. And it was just funny. She says to me one day, "How do you get energy?" And I said to her, well, ironically, what I've found is the most effective way of getting energy is to use energy. When you start exercising, then you feel more energetic. And she pauses for a moment, and then she says, "Yeah, okay, but how do you get energy?" She didn't like that answer. And again, I say this not as a way of making fun of her, but because I knew exactly what she meant. The last thing you want to do when you're not feeling energetic and you want energy is to go feel like you're expending energy you don't have. And I've come to find that 99% of the time, I actually do have that energy. And in fact, it's been a crucial part of my yoga practice is on those days when I feel sluggish, not sick. If you're sick, I mean, take care of yourself. But on those days when you feel sluggish, like, oh, I can't go to yoga today, I don't have the energy. I've come to find those are the days it was most important to get to yoga. And I feel the best afterwards. So just kind of an offhanded mention that consistent physical exercise I've found to be really helpful as well. Something to think about. So I have absolutely gone over in the talking today, which I had a feeling I might, and as I sometimes do. Why don't we get into some practice? Okay. And the one cue I always like to give before we sit is if you are sitting, have your hips elevated higher than your knees if possible, which is helpful for your posture as well as your breathing. If that's not possible right now, not a big deal. Something to keep in mind for the future. Okay. And let's begin, as we always do, by imagining that we are suspended from the ceiling by a piece of string attached to the top of our heads. As a nice cue to sit up straight, without adding any extra tension to do so. If there is some tension here, we don't need to try to get rid of it, which is just trying to force it away by adding tension to the tension, which I don't find that particularly helpful. If there is tension here, I invite you to remember what I mentioned earlier, and will attempt to say again, about the phenomenological approach. Tension is a process. We don't need to create a storyline about it, about where it's from, about where it needs to go, about why it's here, about it's us, or really anything right now. If there is a tension process here, okay, there's a tension process here. Discomfort is allowed. Feelings of failure, as I said earlier, it's allowed. Tension. Tension is allowed. I also like to notice what is in contact with the chair, the cushion, the floor. There's a sense of grounding. There's something holding me up right now, and I can allow it to do so. Let's take a moment to notice the sense of grounding at the bottom, and this gentle lift at the top, and whatever processes are happening in between the two for us right now. however they are. And if you haven't already, you may begin to bring your attention to your breathing. And as I often guide in this practice, we can control and shape the breathing. It's allowed, but it's not necessary. It's not the way I practice. I practice noticing the breathing however it is. Again, taking that phenomenological approach. Very often in this practice, we receive a cue to stay anchored on the breathing by thinking, I am breathing. I breathe in. I breathe out. I don't use that cue either. I notice there is breathing. It's not about me. There's simply a process here. There's a felt process. And we may notice if that felt process is comfortable or uncomfortable. It could be comfortable or uncomfortable at a physical level or a psychological level. Perhaps the body's just fine, but at a psychological level, oh, well, wait a minute, my breathing's supposed to be this way when I meditate. It should be deeper. It should be longer. What's going on here? Meanwhile, your body's like, dude, I'm breathing. I'm fine. What are you stressing about? And sometimes we think that that kind of thinking is getting in the way of our practice. Noticing that thinking is the practice. It's what we came to see. This practice is about noticing what's coming up and what we're doing with what's coming up. What's coming up? Some breathing. What are we doing with the breathing? Oh, we're coming up with a bunch of storylines and making ourselves miserable. Oh, is that necessary? How's it working out for us? Not so good? Let's maybe try something else. Let's take a couple of minutes and see if we can notice the breathing as it is. And what comes up when we notice the breathing as it is. And see if we can let what comes up be as it is. One of the convenient things about this practice in light of what we're talking about today is that we're making space for things to arise. And when we do that, things usually have a way of arising. And some of them are not always comfortable. We may start to experience some physical discomfort from sitting in the same position for a while. I've had some terrific insights around sitting with physical discomfort. I always envisioned physical discomfort, even something like an itch, as being like this monolithic block in a fixed spot, wherever I'm feeling it, and I'm pushing against it. I want to just get rid of it, ignore it, anything. Then when I started this practice, I was like, all right, well, I've been opening up to some of my discomfort psychologically. What happens if I do it with the physical sensations? And boy, was that eye-opening. These things that I thought were monolithic blocks are experiencing movement, pulsation, increasing and decreasing in intensity. And in fact, sometimes when I try to specifically pinpoint where the sensation is originating from, every time I think I found it, it moves. So I go, geez, this experience is not at all what I thought it was like. But to discover that, I had to gain new information. You remember what I said before? Finding your edge. Falling over in a yoga pose. Is it failure? No, it's gaining information. This process of watching what's coming up and seeing what we're doing with it, that's gaining information. The Buddha himself, when he taught, said, look, this is what worked for me, but don't take my word for it. You have to try it for yourself. You have to get your own information. I'm giving you the information I found for me and what it did for me. You got to get your own. No one else can get yours but you. So if something is coming up that perhaps is unpleasant, uncomfortable, not an actual pain. If there's actual pain that needs to be addressed, we address it. But something uncomfortable that we can explore psychologically, physically. What happens if we anchor on the breathing? And check out that process as the process that it is and see what it does when we don't interfere. can be very challenging to stay with the breathing without the mind wandering. It can be very difficult to stay with a process, comfortable or uncomfortable, without weaving a storyline, a narrative, a selfing process around it. It can be very difficult to notice that those things have happened and to not feel like a failure. And every one of those things, the wandering, the narrative, the storyline, feeling of failure, the discomfort itself, all of it. They're all processes. They're all observable. They're all information. They all come under the category of what's coming up and what am I doing with it. And based on what I see what I'm doing with it, what should I do next? And we see how that works out for us. This isn't getting in the way of our practice. This isn't getting in the way of us building that foundation I was talking about. This is the practice. This is the building of the foundation. As they always say, the lotus flower grows out of the mud. No mud, no lotus, right? Anything that comes up in the course of your practice, you can notice as part of your practice. Life is kind enough to send a lot of uncomfortable things our way. So we always have a chance to work with that comfort zone. So as you go through the rest of your day, you might notice now and then what's coming up. What if I come to the breathing as it is for a moment? Notice what it's like. Notice if something is happening, internally or externally, that maybe isn't quite the way I'd like it to be. Physically, mentally, emotionally, financial, relationship, work. And just notice, what does this process, what does it do if I don't try to do anything with it, but notice it? What is it actually like? We start to gain some of that information, develop some of that wisdom. Again, hand in hand with compassion. We may not always like what we see. That's okay. We came to see it. This is how we expand our comfort zone as we walk our path. Thank you, everyone. So I'd love to hear from some of you folks, any questions or observations that might have come up for you.
Thank you. It's very helpful getting out of your comfort zone, and it's not necessarily being stuck in a place or home or anything. It could be anything that you're stuck with, an activity or a thinking. And so that was helpful to think about. And I liked your reference to being in a yoga pose and falling out of it, because we all try for perfection and to make everything perfect. And it doesn't have to be. It's wherever you are that day. So thank you.
Cheers. Yes, absolutely. The old thing about perfection, or perfection being the enemy of good, or good enough, or some such. Yeah, it's definitely a classic overthinking trait. And as I often say, anytime we find ourselves overthinking, that's usually a pretty good sign that we're trying not to feel something. And that's definitely one of those. Like, okay, I have to control every little aspect of this, because if something doesn't go exactly the way I want it to, I'm a failure. Everyone's going to see I'm a failure. Everyone's going to find out my dark little secret that I don't know what the hell I'm doing. And yeah, that is as psychologically paralyzing as agoraphobia is physically. Yeah, right. Absolutely true. That again gets to what I was talking about a couple of moments ago about how this is applicable. We all encounter different things on our paths wildly different things on our paths. But as humans, we all tend to deal with those things that we encounter in very similar ways. So even though our experiences are wildly different, our experiences of our experiences have an awful lot of overlap. So these kinds of tools and techniques, I can talk about them in one context, but they will totally apply in 18 different other contexts, just like you were just mentioning. Exactly.
That's true.
Yeah. Cheers for that. Thank you. Hey, Susan. How's it going?
Hi. Yeah, this was very helpful. I'm just wondering, is this another instance of the way out of something is through it?
Yes, that has been my experience. And I'm going to give the addendum that I always give to that is there's that spiritual phrase of, the only way out is through. And in my experience, that is almost always true. But I always like to add, not necessarily all at once. Sometimes we will put pressure on ourselves to try to get through the whole thing too much, too fast. And as my own teacher is fond of saying, don't make yourself sick getting healthy. That would be the equivalent of me back in my notebook days say, okay, tomorrow I'm going to drive to frickin', I don't know, Connecticut or something, 2 hours or whatever. That would have been asinine. So what we are seeking is almost always on the other side of what we don't want to deal with. And a large part of this practice is not just recognizing that, but also discerning the most skillful way to work our way through it. So we're doing it in a way that is sustaining, not draining. So kind of a long way of saying, yes, but. Cheers. Hi, Maria.
Hi. I noticed that I was tuning into the need to balance intellect and feeling because I know I do tutoring. I love academics. I've had different training with my intuition also. But I find that when making decisions, if I have a lot of options, my tendency is to go to my intellect and logically try to figure it all out. And I know if I could just really trust my feeling a little more for what's the best option in that moment, I could make my decisions could be made a little bit more quickly. Have you ever encountered people that have this similar issue?
Absolutely. Absolutely. He's sitting in my chair right now. I am, as I think I mentioned earlier, I'm left-brained, very intellectually oriented. I have all the classic symptoms. I can't draw, there's no artistic ability, total left brain, total organizational, analytical. And that is one of my challenges as well. In fact, my teacher calls it out regularly is like your greatest strength and weakness is your intellect. And in fact, it reminded me, this was something I brought up with one of my study groups a couple of months ago. I don't know if you ever saw Boardwalk Empire, which is this old gangster show with Steve Buscemi about some of the mob in like Prohibition era. And one of the gangsters on there, it was Arnold Rothstein. A guy playing Arnold Rothstein said this thing I will never forget. I love the shit out of this. He says, if you're ever having trouble making a decision, flip a coin. When it's in the air, you'll know which way you want it to land. That has always stuck with me as that coming to the intuition, coming to the felt sense, rather than getting caught up in the analysis paralysis. Mm-hmm. And that is part of the practice here, is noticing that. When that is coming up for us, because there's nothing wrong with the intellect. We need the intellect as well. Noticing that point at which it is no longer serving us. Okay, I've thought this enough and maybe started to overthink. Let's try something else. I've taken that aspect of this as far as it can go. And the mind likes to think that it's really running the show and it can handle everything. And, the more I do this practice, the more I realize, yeah, sorry, dude, like you're just believing your own press. And yeah, not so much. It's important to recognize for those of us, especially left-brainers, to notice, okay, I'm falling into the intellectualization trap. I'll give one really profound example, a really profound example directly related to this, because it's from Larry Rosenberg, who's the founder of the Cambridge Insight Meditation Center, where I've gone a number of times over the years. Rosenberg, as I'm sure you can gather, is Jewish, grew up during World War II, and for a very long time was very fascinated by Nazi paraphernalia from a historical standpoint, and studied it like meticulously. And he said at one point that he finally realized he was doing that as a way of coping with his fear. He was intellectualizing, turning it into a historical exercise, an intellectual exercise, something that he could think about in a rational way to avoid dealing with the terror that all of this paraphernalia and this symbolism was provoking underneath. He had to do a lot of sitting to realize that. And just to tie it all together, the intellect in that case, for people like you, for people like me, perhaps for people like him, the intellect is our comfort zone. That's our comfort zone. These other parts, maybe not so much. I don't know if I can trust that, or I don't want to feel that, or what have you. I'm going to stay over here in the comfort zone of the intellect. And meanwhile, there's all this unprocessed terror. And is that a good way to live? Not in my experience. So yeah, that's a profound thing to notice and to keep an eye out for. Yeah. Cheers for that. Thank you. Hey, Denise.
One thing that keeps resonating with me as we improve ourselves or strive to, fight against the comfort, limits of comfort zone, is things that are totally beyond our control. I need to get out. You had agoraphobia. I was faced with a situation where I was somewhat quarantined to my home, as a lot of us. And I was wondering how you dealt with being locked down over COVID as limiting your progress.
It's a great question. It was funny when this all started a couple of years ago, because when it did, I was like, wow, this is, I've done this before under very different circumstances. But between having been through it before and the fact that I teach this stuff, I was like, oh, okay, I can kind of be a tour guide for people. Like, this is what it's going to be like, I did have in the back of my mind the understanding that this was going to provide too much comfort for me. And that the longer the quarantine went on, the more there would be, so to speak, a day of reckoning. Like, I knew my comfort zone was probably in some ways going to be shrinking for a while. And it did. It did. And that is something that I started working with in some ways the way I did back in the day. I would just go out and drive just to get out and to be used to being out driving so that the comfort zone didn't get too small. So I literally started doing some of the stuff I was doing in 1998 just because they were kind of the only options available to me. All right, I can go out for a walk. I can go out for a drive. And I mean, even now, I still feel it. There are remnants of it. My comfort zone right now certainly is not what it was 3 years ago at this time. It's just not. But it's not something that concerns me because I still work with it, and in time, and I don't mean I'm housebound or anything like that. I don't have a problem going out and doing stuff. It just causes a little bit more of the anxiety than it used to because I'm not as used to it. But I have become so accustomed to working with anxiety and discomfort for so long now that it's not really an issue. It's just like, oh, okay, I'm going to feel uncomfortable. Okay, so what's that make today? Tuesday? So what? You know, that's the thing about sometimes people get confused about this practice. Well, I thought this practice was going to make it so I never feel uncomfortable again. No, this practice makes it so it doesn't matter if you're feeling uncomfortable. You're always going to feel uncomfortable at some point or another. It makes it so that it's not a goddamn catastrophe when it happens. That's all. That's all.
Yeah. So the other thing that's an adjunct onto that for me, like you say, I like to get out, and so I can get out of my head, because otherwise I'm making up all those stories and stuff, is the things, not just that I can't get out, because sometimes you can get out in your head, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. Read a book, take an adventure. Yeah. But if you get sick and you can't, or another thing that's projecting itself onto me is aging and having limitations, which I deal with daily. And how, in other words, I have a toolbox, and sometimes I don't have access to that toolbox for other reasons. And I'm so afraid of running and not having a tool and losing my mind.
Yes. Aging, sickness, and death. This is what got the Buddha started on his practice. The Buddha, he was the son of a king and spent the first 29 years of his life in utter opulence and comfort, and had no idea of suffering, aging, death. It was all hidden from him. He was the epitome of a life lived in comfort, and was shocked one day upon leaving the castle grounds to see people who were old, people who were sick, people who were dying. And that's what got him started on his spiritual path. It shook him to his core. It's like, the hell is this? Had no idea this was ultimately where we all go. And there's an enormous amount of suffering around that. Again, like I often say, there's going to be pain. And that's synonymous with the discomfort I'm talking about here. You know, that stuff we don't have a choice about. There's going to be aging. Well, if we're lucky, we're going to experience aging. There's probably going to be sickness. There's definitely going to be death. Some of these things are going to be painful. There's no way around that. How we deal with pain and discomfort determines whether or not we suffer. I also find it very difficult when I am sick. That is absolutely an anxiety and depression, but mostly anxiety trigger point for me. Because you can't imagine ever not feeling that way again. It's like, what if this never ends? The sickness itself, don't have a choice about that. That's discomfort, might be pain. Whether it's fatigue or a sore throat or a fever or a pain in the body part or what have you. The storyline of, this is so horrible, what if this never ends? What about this? What about this? What about this? That's suffering. That's suffering. And that's what we want to see. We want to see that process playing out and see that it's not buying us what we think it's going to be buying us. In a way, it's really another intellectualization, if you will. because we're thinking an awful lot about it. But what are we really thinking about? We're thinking about what we don't want to feel. We're thinking about what we don't want to feel. And we're thinking about it incessantly and wondering why we're miserable. And we want to see that that's a process. That is a line of thinking that is arising, and we don't necessarily have a choice that it arises, but we have a lot of thought processes. We have a lot of thought processes arising at any given moment. We're deciding which ones to latch onto and which ones we're going to ride for a while. So why do I keep latching onto that one? Why do I keep riding that one? Well, the same reason we do anything we do. We think we're going to get something out of it. Well, okay, if I think my way through this, one of two things. Either I'm going to solve it somehow, or I'm going to be sufficiently prepared for this horrible feeling that I don't think I'll otherwise be able to handle. At least that's what the two things are for me. That's what I found for myself, why I latch onto dysfunctional thinking patterns. I think either I'm going to find a way to solve this damn thing, or at the very least, I'll be sufficiently prepared for the worst if I can't stop it. And all I do is make myself miserable. And that's what we're here to see.
I'm kind of doing that with current events. And I have a humorous side. So I keep saying, as long as the Celtics keep winning, I'm not going to think about those other current events. I'll focus on that.
Yeah. And sometimes that's fine. Sometimes that's what we got to do, is direct our attention. It's not always a matter of like, okay, you must sit now and keep sitting until, we're learning how to direct our attention skillfully. And there's nothing wrong with taking a break. Take a frickin' break. Go watch a game. Go read a book. It's not always about, okay, you're feeling some discomfort, better get on that cushion. This isn't a militant practice. It's another way of saying, the only way out is through, but you don't have to do it all at once. Like I was saying, 99% of the time, the only way out is through. That other 1% of the time, I have found we can sidestep things. There are some things we don't have to go through. It's like that old joke when they say, pick your battles. And then, no, you're taking too many, not that many. No, put some back, that old joke. In any given moment, we ask ourselves, all right, what's coming up? What am I doing with it? How's it working out for me? And based on how it's working out for me, what do I do next? And how's that working out for me? And the process of doing that is how we develop our tools in that toolbox. So if we perhaps don't have a tool for a particular thing that we're going through because maybe we haven't gone through it yet, that's the process of building it. Oh, okay. There's a spot in my toolbox here that needs filling. Let's start creating that tool. Because every other tool in that toolbox didn't just fall into that. You made that too. You made all those tools. No one can give you your tools. The Buddha himself said, look, this is what I did. You have to try it for yourself. He's like, these are my tools. I can't give them to you. I can show them to you. I can tell you how I made them. You have to make your own. I'll give you the guidebook. Here's how I did it. Highly recommend you try it. It's worked out very well for me. But you have to do it. It's IKEA. You got to put it together. And that's what we do. But the good news is, as we continue to build more and more tools, we get better at the tool building process. As I often say in this practice, we're not just building skills, we're building our skill at building skills. So I hope that gives you something to work with.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
It does.
Cheers. I'll wrap it up there. Okay? Thank you all so much for joining me, everyone. Take care. Cheers.